Hello there everyone, and welcome back to the channel Russia in Context. Today we're going to go on a little adventure here in Moscow, and you may be looking at what's behind me, what's around me, and thinking, well, it doesn't look a lot like Moscow. That looks kind of like a small town or a village somewhere. And, well, you'd be wrong about that. See, obviously when most people think of Moscow, they think of Red Square, or Arbat, or Vdnha, maybe even MKAD, one of the main tourist destinations. But Moscow is a kind of multifaceted city, and it holds surprises everywhere. In fact, where we are right now today is a place that a lot of people who were born and raised in Moscow might not even know exists. So today we're in Kuryanovo.
Kuryanovo feels frozen in time, an artifact of an era long past. The ever-present white noise of traffic near and far is absent, the rustling of leaves in the wind and the chittering of birds taking its place. Instead of towering blocks of flats designed for thousands of residents, small two-story houses identical in design face each other across narrow streets closed in by arbor canopies, each residence given personality thanks to yards surrounded by picket fences. Some lush patches of half-wild vegetation reminiscent of a jungle, with others the work of loving hands that have planted flowers and tended to berry bushes and fruit-bearing trees for decades. To be sure, this is not what the typical Soviet neighborhood looked like, not by a long shot. It is, however, the idealized version of it, a more communal version of suburban America. As with everything in the former USSR, however, this region of Moscow, with a population slightly more than 30,000, exists to fulfill a specific purpose. And that purpose is, well, not the most pleasant. This is the Kurьяновские water treatment facilities. For Moscow, a colossal system of waterworks is required to handle the over 3 million cubic meters of wastewater that is generated by Muscovites daily. However, before this territory became the modern-looking utilities hub that we see here from above, it had more modest origins.
So right now, we are out in front of Mosvodokанал, Курьяновские, очистные сооружения, which is basically where all of the water in Moscow comes to be cleaned. I'd say it's a sewage plant, but that's not entirely correct. So basically, this whole area, back in the 1930s, as the city was starting to grow and the Bolsheviks were starting to get themselves organized a little bit, they realized that they needed a better way to deal with the wastewater that the city was producing. And we're just going to take a walk around a little bit right here. You can see this nice old pink building back there. We'll come to that. Anyway, the Bolsheviks, they decided that they needed to build a whole processing facility. And in this part of the city, down by Lublino, they had, I don't remember what it was called. They had some fields. They had an area down here where they processed the water before, but they decided to take the area where there was a village, Kuryanovo, and they, in 1930s, they moved everybody out of the village. In fact, if you look at a map of Moscow right now, in the area that is Yuzhnaya Butovo, there's a location called Novo Kuryanovo. So basically in the 1930s, they took the whole village that lived in this area and they moved them out, way out of the city. And on place of the village, they built a wastewater processing facility. And they kept the name Kuryanovo. So the whole reason that this area exists is because the city needs, well, to process wastewater, like all cities do. All large cities have it. Moscow has it in an area that is, well, very out of the way. I like how here, too, in the background, you can see that brick tower, the brick water tower back there, would also be an artifact from the 1950s. Now, why build the wastewater treatment facility specifically here? Well, obviously it's right on the river, so that is a big part of it. But the other thing that's important to remember is this is kind of its own closed-off little territory. In the Soviet Union, things connected to public infrastructure were all guarded by the state. They were all sort of, I don't remember if it was for secretive reasons or for security purposes, probably both. And because of a railroad that runs and kind of cuts off this area on the southeast portion of it, and the river on the north side of it surrounding it, it basically has this whole area cut off. There's no way to access it easily, even today in 2023. They've recently built the, I believe it's Юго-Восточный хорда, so the southeast, it's like a highway, southeast highway. And they recently opened some new rail lines. МКАД 2 goes through here, which is kind of like the metro, but not exactly. Regardless, it's still not easy to get here. And most people in Moscow don't even know that it exists. So yeah, they built it down here specifically because A, it was on the river, it needed to be down here, but then most importantly, it was very easy to close off. So even though the wastewater plant got started back in the 1930s, construction on this area didn't really begin until after World War II, in the 1950s. So all of this architecture is Stalin era, kind of, you know, post-war Stalin era, later Stalin era. I don't know, I'm not an expert on Stalinist architecture, but and there are rumors, you can read them online and things like that, that just like with most rumors of post-war construction, that this area was built by former German prisoners of war. That isn't the case. There's no evidence of that. However, it is basically confirmed, 100% the case, that it was built by prisoners. Zek, which are the sort of, well, Stalin's prisoners. So, you know, maybe political, that type of stuff. Good stuff. Built by prisoners nonetheless. But yeah. And these houses, I'm gonna kind of go over here into the shade so we can get a good look at this one right here, because it's in really good condition. And you can see here there are kind of two entrances, right? Now, when these were built, there would have been 4 apartments in this building, unless there are 2 entrances from the other side, in which case there would have been 8, but I'm pretty sure on this building there are just the 2 entrances. Now, each entrance was responsible for 2 apartments, so you had one on the top floor and one on the bottom floor. It's basically like a duplex in the States, except split also between floors. And because during the Stalin era, a lot of times apartments were shared between families, you actually had 2 families per apartment. And for anybody watching this outside of Russia, that's going to sound like hell on earth. But in the early Soviet Union, there was this thing called a kommunalka, which was basically a shared apartment. And at the time, and for a lot of early Soviet history, kommunalkas were shared by many more families than 2. So, you know, the prospect of coming to live here and only having to share your apartment with one other family would have seemed a little bit like paradise, especially considering the fact that they all had these yards attached to them. It was a very kind of quiet and green territory. And yeah, and so it did help attract people to this region. All right, we're going to cut from, I believe that was Третья Курьяновская улица. Yep. And we're going to go through this kind of alleyway. Now, if you read people who have lived in this area, if you read what their memories online, this would have been where kids would have played back in the day. Obviously, there weren't that many cars in the Soviet Union to begin with, but this would have been completely free of any vehicles and kind of behind the houses, away from prying eyes. You know how kids like to play. It does look like there is a vehicle right here now, but they are doing their garage thing. So yeah, we're just gonna go through this alleyway. Obviously, alleyways like this just don't exist in Moscow. Although that's kind of the one neat thing about this region, is this feels very much like a very small provincial city. Even in the Moscow Oblast, you don't see places like this anymore. It feels like we've been transported far away from Moscow, or at the very least back in time. So we are here on Вторая Курьяновская улица, and we're going to take a look at some more houses here just because they are pretty neat. Love the fact that the yards are all kind of, it has kind of like an American vibe to it, as strange as that may sound. I mentioned it feels Russian provincial, but just the way that you can actually see your neighbors. There are fences, but none of them are super high. If you go most places in Russia nowadays, they either have just straight up metal fences you can't see. Like for example, this fence right here, you can't see anything through it, but it's still low enough that you can see over it. So it does give it more of a neighborhood feel, something that you just don't normally see in Russia. Right, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that was this idea of, okay, so we have all these really nice houses, and they didn't really have to share them with anybody, so why didn't everybody want to come live down here? Well, there's always a benefit. If there's a benefit, there's always going to be a cost to it. And in this situation, the cost is pretty simple. In order to live in a house like this back in the Soviet Union, the cost that you had to pay would have come from, well, let's just say isolation. So this whole area back in the Soviet Union was a closed territory, meaning that the only people who could come here were people who lived here. And in order to get in to the territory, you had to have a reason for it. So basically, if you lived in Kuryanovo back in the Soviet Union, your whole life was here. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Kuryanovo had a hospital. Kuryanovo had a school and kindergartens. It had shops. And obviously, it had employment. There were factories, and also there was, again, the main factory, the sewage treatment plant. So the people who lived down here, they had everything they needed. And even though it wasn't very convenient to travel to get here, it honestly still is not very convenient to travel to get here, they didn't need to go anywhere. So that was kind of the trade-off. Yes, you lived kind of in Moscow, although technically Kuryanovo did not become part of Moscow until 1960. But at the same time, you were not really part of Moscow. You lived in your own kind of private territory, and that was just the way it was. It's also worth mentioning that sewage treatment plant, we've been out here walking around for hours now. Haven't had a whiff of any unpleasant odors. That said, that might have to do with the fact that in 2015 they modernized the whole process and covered it up. So if we were here, we'll say 20 years ago, the scent on the streets might have been substantially more unpleasant. As it is right now too, the wind is blowing in the correct direction. It's blowing it away from us. So, but yeah, that would be another kind of downside in the past to living in this region. Yes, you're in the city. Yes, you're living like you're in a village, but could be kind of stinky. Also, fun little fact, down in Kuryanovo is where Russian athletes, specifically archers, do their training. This is the sort of Olympic training grounds, or one of them, I suppose we'll say. So we have some old Soviet-style garages, which is, you know, you actually see these quite often in other regions of the city. But I want to actually focus my attention and your attention on this little building right here with the mossy covered roof. There's actually a mossier covered roof in the background, but this one still has quite a bit on it. And all of these little wooden doors. Now, I don't exactly, well, they're not all wooden too. Some of them are metal at this point in time, but there's definitely a wooden one right here. I don't know exactly what these are for. We can see that they are largely padlocked. Now, I would imagine that these were storage for people who lived in these houses. We can see these houses right here. These would have been with multiple apartments, and it would have given them a place to keep stuff.
And while my assumptions about storage were correct for how these spaces are used today, that's not the story of how they were originally used. When Kuryanovo welcomed its first inhabitants, the city hadn't extended gas lines to the new region, so cooking had to be done on wood-burning stoves, which would have also provided heat in the cold months. Likewise, the Soviet Union had only just began producing refrigerators, so such luxuries would not have been available anywhere in the region. Those small sheds were dug out on the inside, so that food, which spoils quickly, could be kept underground on ice throughout the warmer months, with an area above where firewood could be stored.
But, yeah, just look at these yards. Look at these yards. It's like you're in the countryside. This is in Moscow, in a very industrialized portion of Moscow, so keep that in mind. What's really pretty interesting too, yeah, you can see here, right? Apartments 1 through 6, entrance number 1, there's glass on the doors. Just very unusual. You don't see that normally. So I don't know if in this whole building that means there's 6. No, there's another podъезд on the other side. So yeah, you can see, right? 1 and then 2. So I would assume in this whole building here, we can kind of see there are maybe 12 apartments. Here is one of the first actually kind of tall buildings here. The only one I've seen so far, 5 stories. I don't know actually when this was built. I would assume later in the Soviet era, just because in the 50s when the other houses were built, there would have been no need for this, but came from back down that way. The main street is that way, and then we have just another one of these really nice old houses. Love it. And I know it might annoy the living crap out of Americans watching this, but I love, look at the yard. It's overgrown, and like, that's awesome. There's life here. There are birds, there are mice, there are animals, there are things. And you know, in suburban America, or suburban wherever you're watching this from, you might not appreciate that because you do have that, but in a city like Moscow, if you have something like this and you do have birds and small animals running around and inhabiting, well, near people, then that's just something else. It's really nice. Also, it makes it so much cooler. It's really warm today, really hot. Maybe the hottest day of the summer that we've had in Moscow. Maybe the hottest one that I can remember, at least. And just being able to come into the shade like this, right? And just get out of the heat. There's not so much asphalt everywhere. Look at, like, the roads are so narrow. God, it's just so nice. It's a little oasis in the middle of the city. As strange as that may sound. I don't know if we can see this too. I'm gonna come up here. Just got like the spider web here, just in between the trees. It's just, it feels like the countryside, and it is lovely. Kind of scan around here too. We got like a little park. Nothing special, but well, they've actually redone a bit of it here too. And unfortunately, it looks like there in the middle, where there used to be a fountain, there is no more. But that's okay. Maybe they're making repairs to it. So the further you get from that little center street area, where the original houses were, you start to get more of these taller buildings, like this one back here. I don't know if this is 4 or 5 stories. There is another one over there. So yeah, this would have been obviously later, and it looks like there's a whole series of them. I can see another one right over here. So the further you get away from the center, the taller the buildings become. I'm not gonna go all the way out there because it's still a ways from here, but the tallest building in the entire region is only 9 stories tall. It's from the very late Soviet, I think it was built in 1987. But yeah, even honestly, even like this is just sort of classic, old, quiet Soviet neighborhood stuff, and it's great. I mean, like, I'm gonna pan back over here. You got the flowers growing people used to spend a lot of time building up the areas in front of their buildings. Now, part of the reason they don't do that so much anymore is because, well, the city has grown a lot and people don't feel as invested in their buildings. You still find a lot of stuff like this, especially in older neighborhoods. But part of the reason you don't see as many people doing their own landscaping is the city of Moscow will come in and just sort of redo stuff as they like. So if the city of Moscow decides that they need to put in a new sidewalk, they will just rip everything out, and it doesn't matter how much time and effort was put into making an area like this look green and beautiful, or green and wild, or whatever. The city will just come in and tear it out. So that might be also part of the reason, especially in the newer parts of the city, that you don't see bushes like this. I'm not an expert here, but I feel like, no, these aren't. We do have some wasps flying around here, though you can't really see them. And, you know, I don't think here, but I do know sometimes... No. Are those raspberries? No, those aren't raspberries. Those are shipovniki, I believe. Rose hips. So, but you can sometimes in yards like this also find raspberries growing. People would plant things like that back in the day. I saw cherries somewhere earlier. I didn't film it, which is kind of dumb on my part, but yeah, you know, they don't plant things like that anymore because people aren't as invested in it. And so you come to a place like this and yeah, even though it doesn't look super fancy, even though it looks kind of run down, this right here is the reason I think when people come to Russia and they stay for a long time, this is what they fall in love with. But there's other reasons too. And it's not just Russia. A lot of the former Soviet Union is like this. You go to Belarus, you go to Ukraine. Can't really talk about Central Asia. I don't really have any experience there, but yeah, it's beautiful. And of course, how can you have a proper little Soviet neighborhood if you don't have Lenin? Honestly, it's kind of hard to find nowadays, especially in Moscow. So him looking as regal as he does right here, and how should we say, bird splattered as well. It's a bit uncommon for Moscow. We look here on both sides of this square. We have kind of these older buildings as well too. I'm sure they would have been administrative buildings back in the day. One is now a post office, and that first one was connected to kind of the police. But Lenin standing here holding court on what looks to be a lovely day, but is kind of sweltering, not gonna lie. And opposite Lenin is one of the most important buildings, or what would have been one of the most important buildings back in the day. Right now it is the center of Moscow long life, Center Moskovskого долголетия. I don't know if long life, but it is the old Dom Kultury, that big circle in the center right there. Would have said that in the past. And this right here, this is what all provincial centers would have had. This was the heart of any good Soviet community back in the day. And this, honestly, this building is a gem. It is just this sort of neoclassical Stalin era, before they started getting rid of all these extravagant elements to the architecture in the later Soviet period. But this right here with the columns and then the star and the little ornamentation at the top, we're going to come in here and take a closer look. This right here is perfect. It's fantastic. Obviously, we're not going to go in right now because we don't have any business being in there, and there's somebody in there waving some sticks around. But yeah, this would have been the heart of the community. The community opens up back that way, and so at the very front of it, you would have had the Dom Kultury, which is still standing. I believe it's an architectural monument in the city, thankfully. And honestly, it's the only place in Moscow you're gonna find a building like this. You gotta come to Kuryanovo. So, yeah, check it out.
One last view out the window, a final opportunity to take in this quaint and overlooked part of Moscow before returning to the hustle and bustle of the city at large. As Moscow expands and grows denser, it feels like an inevitability that the low green neighborhood on the right will eventually be consumed. But if Kuryanovo has managed to survive the turbulent and unimaginable changes of the last 7 decades, largely unchanged, there's hope that it might continue to hold out. A much-needed time capsule that becomes all the more valuable with each passing year. If you've made it all the way through and enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I plan on doing a few more videos like this in the coming months, as well as some beyond the borders of Moscow. I realize I don't churn these things out as fast as I could, and the thing is I'd rather focus on quality over quantity, which the YouTube algorithm doesn't seem to care for. So for this reason, if you liked what you saw, please comment down below. It does help increase the likelihood of this video being seen by others. As it is, I hope you had a good time exploring Kuryanovo with me. Until next time, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.